Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. In the eternal screaming storm that is the warp, where the very fabric of reality writhes with emotion and hunger, the existence of a place devoid of demons seems not just unlikely, it feels heretical to even imagine. The immaterium is chaos. It is where nightmares are born, where desire takes form, where hatred and ecstasy become claws and teeth. To speak of a corner of that infernal sea where such entities cannot survive is to utter a contradiction, a violation of the very nature of existence as we know it. And yet there are whispers, cold, brittle whispers that speak of a frozen region in the warp, not icy in temperature but in essence, where daemons die not in battle but in silence, where their forms unravel not torn by blades but unmade by a lack of something fundamental: emotion, belief, madness, soul. This is not a story of hope. This is not a triumph over chaos. What lies within the frozen warp is not salvation, but something even the most depraved servants of the ruinous powers fear to name. It is the stillness that comes before the end of all things. A place so cold, so utterly absent of psychic resonance, that even the gods avert their gaze. In the warp, absence is death. And this region is the very definition of absence. Welcome to the edge of the unthinkable. To understand the monstrous anomaly that is the frozen warp, we must first truly grasp the nature of the warp itself, not merely as a mechanic for faster-than-light travel or a backdrop for psychic phenomena, but as the twisted, boiling heart of emotion incarnate. The immaterium is not a place in any conventional sense. It is not space, not time. It is a realm of pure thought, of unchecked emotion, of infinite malice and boundless ecstasy. Every fear ever screamed in the dark, every lustful thought, every act of cruelty or devotion, they echo in the warp, they live there, and eventually they grow teeth. Daemons are not aliens. They are not life forms, not truly. They are thoughts that have grown monstrous, archetypes made flesh. A daemon of corn is not simply a creature of war. It is wrath given claws, the endless scream of bloodlust coalesced into something that hungers for more. A daemon of Slanesh is the final tremor of indulgence, the gasp of the addict, the lustful whisper at the end of innocence. These entities are born from the warp, and the warp is born from us, from all sentient beings who feel, dream, hate, hope. To exist in the warp is to swim through a sea of feelings so intense they can rip the soul apart. What makes this realm survivable for entities like daemons is this unending saturation of emotion. The warp feeds them, shapes them, sustains them. Remove that emotional energy, and you rob daemons of their essence. Unlike mortal creatures who rely on flesh, daemons rely on resonance, on belief, on terror, on fervor. It is not merely that they need worship, but that they are composed of the very vibrations of obsession and nightmare. In this way, they are more akin to fire than beast. Fire that feeds not on oxygen, but on sin and thought. It is no coincidence that the warp reflects the collective unconscious of all intelligent life. Civilizations on the edge of extinction flood the warp with despair. Worlds locked in endless war drown it in rage. Planets reveling in decadent pleasure offer it nectar. The immaterium is shaped by us as much as it shapes us, a cyclical inferno where cause and effect blur. From this crucible emerge the Great Four, the gods of chaos. Vast intelligences composed of aeons of mortal emotion, and from them their legions of daemons, ever eager to pour through the thinning veil into real space, to gorge on the raw sustenance of souls. Yet despite this horror, there is an internal logic, a consistency to the warp's malevolence. Its currents may be chaotic, but they are predictable in their volatility. A navigator learns to sail by feeling the flows of madness, by steering through storms of anguish and eddies of desire. A psyker draws upon this churning sea to ignite their powers, gambling with every breath that they will not attract the attention of something far worse than themselves. The warp is dangerous, yes, but it is understood. It is expected. It is, in a twisted sense, reliable in its hunger, which is why the existence of a place within it that lacks all this, that repels it, chokes it, is so unnatural, so offensive to the very structure of the universe. To have a place where daemons cannot survive is not just strange. It is a metaphysical impossibility. It suggests that the warp, the very canvas upon which the drama of chaos is painted, can rot. That there can be regions where the brush strokes do not hold, that the music of madness can fall silent, and for beings who know only noise, only sensation, That silence is the truest death. The daemons themselves, when they can be forced to speak of it, through summoning rituals etched in pain or the agonizing dissection of captured warp entities, refuse to name it. Not out of ignorance, but out of dread. They do not understand why such a region exists, only that to enter it is to dissolve, not with a scream, but with a whimper. Some say it is akin to a psychic vacuum, others call it a null field so absolute it devours even thought. But to those born of the warp's furnace, such emptiness is more terrifying than any blade. Imagine a sea creature being thrust into the vacuum of space. Imagine the panic, the collapse, the dying thrash of something utterly removed from its element. This is what daemons face in the frozen warp. If they even make it that far, many are repelled before reaching its edge, their forms unraveling like cloth in fire. Others, more powerful, make it through, but only just. Their screams echoing not in sound, but in raw emotional reverberation that fades far too quickly. And so, we begin to see the nature of the crime the frozen warp commits against chaos itself. It is not content to oppose, it negates, it does not fight demons, it denies their very basis for existence. To those of us raised in a galaxy aflame with unending war, this might seem a miracle. But in truth, it may be the most terrifying anomaly of all, a corner of madness that has gone cold. And nothing is more frightening than what should not be. To speak of the metaphysics of the warp is to willingly walk the blade's edge between madness and revelation. The immaterium is not governed by physics as we understand them. It does not adhere to the rules of mass, force, or inertia. It obeys a different law, a deeper, older kind of logic rooted in thought, belief, and perception. If the material universe is built on particles and causality, the warp is structured, if such a word even applies, by psychic density, emotional resonance, and conceptual gravity. And from these twisted foundations arise the theories that might, just might, explain the impossible existence of the frozen warp. The first concept that demands our attention is that of emotional density, a theoretical measurement of the psychic weight of a region within the warp. Where emotions are strong and sustained, the warp thickens, becomes more volatile, more malleable to demonic influence. Think of it like pressure in a boiler. More anger, more fear, more worship, more despair, and the boiler screams louder. This density determines how easily reality can be pierced, how quickly daemons can manifest, how violently storms of unreality erupt. In this model, the warp is not a sea, but a pressure system of boiling thought states. Now, if that pressure suddenly drops, not merely depressurizing like a calm sea, but plunging into negative emotional space, then we reach the realm of metaphysical implosion. A place with no psychic weight, no emotional density, would not simply be empty. It would be antithetical to demonic life. Not inert, but hostile in its nullity. The frozen warp could thus be understood as a psychic vacuum, a negative pressure zone so devoid of emotion that it inverts the fundamental resonance daemons require to exist. They are not destroyed by force or banishment, but unmade at the level of identity. The second theoretical framework is conceptual inertia, the resistance of an idea or belief change within the warp. Daemons thrive where concepts are stable and intense. War, lust, decay, change. These constants form the ideological bedrock upon which the gods of chaos stand. But if a region were to possess zero conceptual inertia, if no idea, belief, or emotion could take root, then the entire infrastructure of daemonic presence would collapse. A daemon cannot exist in a vacuum of meaning. Its form, its name, its shape, all depend on the persistence of an emotional or conceptual theme. This leads to the third fan theory model, reality pressure. While the warp often bleeds into real space through psychic activity and sorcerous ritual, the boundary between the two realms is not uniform. Certain areas of space exhibit strong reality pressure, a kind of resistance that pushes back against the incursion of unreality. Think of it as psychic gravity, pulling thoughts back into the physical, anchoring the immaterial with the weight of existence. If the frozen warp sits at the intersection of multiple such high-pressure zones, then its very nature could act as a bulwark against chaos, not through power, but through suffocating certainty. But there is a darker thought, one that chills the soul. What if the frozen warp is not a natural anomaly, but a scar? A wound in the fabric of the immaterium, where the laws of the warp have been forcibly suppressed or rewritten. Perhaps a relic of some long-lost war between gods even the Chaos Pantheon fears to remember. Perhaps the trace of a forgotten weapon, a conceptual neutron bomb that did not cleanse the area with flame, but scrubbed it of all meaning, all passion, all resonance. An emotional extinction event. Some inquisitorial fringe theorists whisper of an ancient psychic catastrophe, so vast in its voidness that it infected the warp itself. A civilization so devoted to stillness, to detachment, to emotional silence, that its death throes created a null echo that continues to expand. Not a scream, but a sigh that never ends. In this theory, the frozen warp is not a place, but a memory, a lingering afterimage of perfect negation. It doesn't radiate power, it absorbs everything, including the idea of power. And then there's the truly blasphemous speculation that the frozen warp is not an accident, but a message. A shape in the storm, etched by something greater than the chaos gods. A statement, perhaps even a warning, that demons are not the top of the immaterium's food chain, that there exists a higher order of psychic reality, one that does not seethe with madness but stands still. Cold, silent, unyielding. An anti-chaos so complete that it does not rage or war or seduce. It simply is, and in its presence, all else withers. We cannot test these theories. No ship dares linger in the frozen warp. No psyker can safely extend their mind into it. The very act of perceiving it erodes cognition. And yet, it exists. And its existence violates everything we believe about the nature of chaos, of emotion, of reality itself. It is a hole in the fabric of madness, and what lies on the other side is not sanity, but something even more terrifying. The absolute absence of anything at all. There are places in the galaxy that are never named in full. Not because they are unknown, but because their names have become entangled with whispers, omens, and psychic shivers that slither through the minds of those who speak them. The frozen warp is one such myth. It doesn't appear on any sanctioned imperial star charts, and no navigator guild openly acknowledges its existence. But the stories persist. Scattered across fragments of ship logs, encoded into forbidden texts, and murmured in the lunatic ravings of astropaths who dream not of stars, but of a cold place where even dreams go to die. One of the earliest references comes not from an Adeptus record, but from a Xenos data plaque uncovered in the ruins of a long-dead civilization in the halo stars. The Ordo Xenos classified the language as untranslatable, yet a fragment was interpreted through psi-linguistic resonance, the ice that burns thought. The civilization was gone, not conquered, not devoured, just absent. No ruins, no bones, just a void as though it had been gently erased from time. The theory? They touched something in the warp that didn't scream back, something that absorbed even the echo of their existence. Other reports are more desperate, more human. Black ship logs recovered during a failed rescue mission near the Ghoul stars describe a deep space anomaly encountered mid-transit. The astropath assigned to the vessel reported that her psychic link to the Astronomicon flickered, not disrupted by warp storms but silenced. Her notes speak of a pressure in her skull that felt like falling into a silence so thick it suffocated thought. The ship's navigator, an aging scion of House Mortem, was found dead in his chamber with his third eye burned black. No wounds, no damage to the ship, just a lifeless husk floating in deep space, days outside of the anomaly's supposed edge. Then there are the rogue traders. Unreliable, yes, but not always dishonest. One report from an ancient dynastic lineage, sealed in a vault beneath the Scala Pergenium on Ophelia VII, tells of a route discovered by accident, a cold corridor within the warp that seemed serene at first. No turbulence, no demonic interference, no whispers of madness. But over the course of 3 jumps, the Jeller field began to flicker. Not because of demonic incursion, but because it had nothing to repel. The void beyond the hull was still, emotionless. The ship's choir went catatonic. The trader ordered an emergency re-entry. Of the crew, only one remained sane enough to testify, and she clawed her own eyes out before the Inquisition could interrogate her. The Inquisition itself holds fragments of truth buried beneath layers of redaction. In Ordo Malleus vaults, particularly those belonging to radical factions, there are documents written in code and desperation. One speaks of an exterminatus order issued not on a planet, but on a section of warp space, a cleansing fire directed into a psychic vacuum, as if the mere existence of the frozen warp demanded obliteration. Another file, tagged with Inquisitor Caledron's seal, lists Category Sigma Null Zone SCP-Z014, with the addendum: no contact, no probes, no mines, no light, let it starve. The navigators, perhaps the most attuned to the truth, remain disturbingly silent on the matter. When asked in private about unnatural stillnesses in the warp, many deflect, others invoke ancient oaths, and a few simply leave the room without speaking. One fugitive navigator, later executed for heresy, was recorded describing a zone of psychic frost, in which the Astronomicon flickered like a dying candle. Her maps were burned, her mind scrubbed, but the words remained in the data slate. It's not death, it's not corruption, it's nothing, and it's hungry. There are whispers too from the Black Library, fragments captured by the rare few who've glimpsed its pages and lived. Eldar seers speak of the Starless Maw, a region even their ancestors dared not dream near. It is a void not of space, but of soul. A place where the threads of fate refuse to pass. If the warp is a tapestry, then this is the tier. Unstitched, unweaving, unmaking. And perhaps the Laughing God, or some older force, sealed it away not with locks but with silence. Not all reports are ancient. In recent years, with the tearing of the Cicatrix Maledictum, new anomalies have been logged. Ships flung into strange regions, only to emerge reporting nothing. No visions, no screams, no demonic interference. Just blankness. Psychic dead zones with coordinates that seem to drift, as if the frozen warp is not bound by our understanding of distance. A creeping infection, perhaps, or a predator moving through the sea of souls with glacial patience. It is tempting to dismiss these accounts as exaggerations, the desperate scrawlings of minds unmoored, but their consistency cannot be ignored. The way they all describe the same absence, not a danger, not a storm, but a stillness, a hunger that does not consume but erases. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is what the demons fear most. Not defeat, not pain, but oblivion. The frozen warp offers no glory, no vengeance, no rebirth, only stillness. Of all the fan theories surrounding the frozen warp, the most unnerving and perhaps the most plausible is the emotional vacuum theory. In essence, this theory posits that the frozen warp is not defined by what it is, but by what it lacks. Where most regions of the immaterium are saturated with raw, volatile emotion, the psychogenic energy that sustains daemons and empowers psychers, the frozen warp is thought to be utterly devoid of such resonance. Not merely quiet or calm, but entirely barren of emotion. It is a place that neither reflects nor responds to the psychic tides of the soul. It is, in the truest sense, an emotional void. To appreciate the horror of this concept, one must first understand how central emotion is to the immaterium. Every act of love, hatred, fear, joy, sorrow, and ecstasy contributes to the warp's swirling chaos. These are not just ephemeral feelings, but tangible energies in that realm, shaping its landscape and giving birth to its most terrifying denizens. Daemons are not born. They are formed, assembled from concentrated emotional archetypes. Entire warp storms can erupt from particularly traumatic planetary events. A world's extinction scream can echo for centuries in the warp, becoming a lighthouse of grief or rage that draws predators beyond comprehension. But in the frozen warp, these rules appear inverted. Instead of responding to emotion, it annihilates it. Instead of reflecting thought and feeling, it devours them. This is the core of the emotional vacuum theory, that the region acts as a psychic singularity, not through strength but through absolute negation. Emotion does not merely dissipate, it ceases to exist within its boundaries. And when something as foundational as fear or faith vanishes, so too do the creatures that depend on them. Daemons, whose forms are defined by such resonance, cannot maintain cohesion. They unravel at the conceptual level. It is akin to trying to maintain a flame in the void of space. It does not simply flicker out, it cannot ignite in the first place. In the frozen warp, there is no oxygen of thought, no fuel of belief. The very medium of their existence is absent. Some theorists imagine it as a kind of anti-warp, not another dimension but a dry spot in the emotional ocean. Not dead, but never alive. A cold place untouched by the passions that animate all things psychic. The implications of such a phenomenon are vast. Consider the psychic feedback loop that defines so much of chaos's power. Worship strengthens the gods reward their servants, and belief intensifies. This cycle fuels the wars that rend the galaxy. But what happens when belief hits a wall of silence? When sacrifice brings no reward? When screams are not answered by demonic laughter, but swallowed by apathy? This is not resistance. This is disconnection. And for beings forged from the forge of obsession, disconnection is erasure. There are testimonies from psychers who have brushed the edges of this region and lived, barely. One, a sanctioned psyker from a doomed expedition, claimed she felt her soul detach from her body as her thoughts failed to echo back from the warp. She described it as thinking into a black mirror that refused to recognize reflection. Her connection to the Empyrean snapped, not severed by violence, but by indifference. Another spoke of memories unspooling inside his mind, his identity losing weight as the emotional gravity around him collapsed. If these reports are accurate, then the frozen warp may not merely neutralize demonic entities, it may also destabilize sentient thought itself. Our minds, after all, are not just meat and neurons. They are architectures of emotion reinforced by memory, belief, and passion. To enter a place where those structures find no purchase is to begin unraveling not just what we are, but that we are. Identity requires reflection. Purpose requires resistance. In the frozen warp, there is neither. There are whispers among the more radical tech priests of Mars, particularly those who have dabbled in the fusion of machine logic and psychic resonance, that the region may represent a kind of perfect logic field, a state in which no irrational impulse can survive, where noise becomes signal and signal becomes silence. To such minds, the frozen warp is not a threat, but a purity, the dream of ultimate structure imposed upon the last realm of chaos. It is not entropy, it is negentropy. But to the rest of us, this dream is a nightmare, a place where nothing stirs because nothing is allowed to exist. Even more unsettling is the possibility that the frozen warp is expanding. If emotion is not merely absent within, but actively devoured, then the region could be growing, slowly, imperceptibly, feeding not on matter, but on resonance. Systems that once pulsed with psychic energy now fall quiet. Daemon worlds flicker and die. The Astronomican's reach shivers at its edges. We measure these changes with instruments we barely trust, and all the while the silence creeps forward. It is the final heresy, that the warp, eternal and ever-hungering, could one day freeze. Not in a great cataclysm, but in gradual, merciless stillness. That the gods of chaos could starve not from resistance, but from emotional famine. And that at the end of all things, the galaxy will not burn, but shiver. Quietly. As even the last scream finds no echo. There are some among the Inquisition, and even a few radical magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who whisper that the frozen warp is not a natural void, nor an ancient scar, but a divine footprint, a lingering echo of the Emperor's passage through the Immaterium. This is the echoes of the Emperor's light theory, and while it borders on blasphemy to some and heresy to others, it carries with it a weight of poetic resonance that cannot be dismissed outright. What if the stillness, the silence that unravels demons, is not a thing of chaos at all, but the shadow cast by supreme order? The Emperor, in his mortal form, was already beyond comprehension, a psyker whose power eclipsed any since the dawn of the galaxy. He bent the warp to his will not by joining the storm, but by stilling it. During the Great Crusade, it is said that he walked the Immaterium in ways no other being ever dared, not as a god of madness, but as a sovereign of purpose. His light, the Astronomican, is the only beacon known to calm the tides of the warp, to impose direction upon directionless fury. And within that logic lies a terrifying possibility, that the frozen warp is not an anomaly. It is a byproduct of his presence. Imagine the Emperor, not as a manipulator of warp energy, but as a suppressor of it. His psychic signature may not amplify the Immaterium, but cancel it. In this light, the frozen warp becomes a burn mark, a region where his essence flared so powerfully that it seared the warp clean, removing not only daemons but the very ability to feel. The gods of chaos feed on emotion. The Emperor, in this theory, denies it. Where they burn, he freezes. Where they howl, he silences. Perhaps the warp itself recoils from his imprint, like a flame retreating from ice. There are arcane writings long suppressed, which claim that the Emperor once attempted to craft a psychic singularity, a point of absolute control in the warp that could serve as an anchor, a bastion, a bulwark against chaos. The frozen warp could be the fallout of that failed project. Or perhaps its only success, a perfect field of psychic nullification, too dangerous to sustain, too pure to be destroyed. Its existence may have cost him something profound. Perhaps that is why he lies silent on the golden throne, not just wounded, but psychically entangled in the very silence he created. Others suggest it is the Astronomicon itself that has carved this hollow. As the Astronomicon pulses with the focused will of thousands of psychers, channeling the Emperor's might, it projects more than light. It projects intent. And if that intent includes denial of chaos, the erosion of demonic influence, then the resulting resonance might not simply guide navigators, it might erode entire swathes of the immaterium. Over millennia, this psychic wind could hollow out the warp itself, creating zones of dead resonance where daemons cannot tread. There is a disturbing implication here. If the Astronomicon can cleanse the warp in this way, is it doing so by accident or design? And if by design, who designed it? The Emperor, certainly, but did he intend to create a passive guidance system for ships, or a slow-acting nullification weapon aimed at chaos itself? The silence of the frozen warp may not be silence at all. It may be the voice of the Emperor still speaking, not through words, but through the absence of madness. Some among the more esoteric cults of the Adeptus Ministorum have gone even further. They speak of the frozen warp as his domain, a place in the immaterium where only the faithful may tread. A realm of peace in a universe of torment, a purgatory for the pure. They say that demons cannot enter because the region already belongs to a higher power, one that does not shriek or whisper, but simply exists, eternal, silent, watching. It is a vision of hope so cold and alien that it borders on dread, a god who wins not by saving but by deleting the very battlefield. If this is true, then the Emperor may not merely be the anathema to chaos, he may be the opposite of chaos entirely. Not a being of war and fire, but one of stasis and light, a force not of rage but of resolution. And perhaps the daemons do not flee the frozen warp out of fear for their lives, but for their definitions. For in that place they are not tortured, nor banished, nor slain. They are simply not. This casts the heresy, the throne, and the entire Imperium in a new and terrible light. What if the final weapon against chaos was never exterminatus or grey knights or holy relics? What if it was silence, true, absolute silence, wielded by a mind so vast that even the warp itself must pause before it? What if the Emperor did not merely ascend into godhood, but sank into something colder, something more final? A state of being so still that chaos cannot see it, touch it, or survive near it. If the frozen warp is his shadow, then we may be glimpsing the end of the great game, not with a scream, not with a roar, but with the quiet, patient erasure of all that defies his will. The daemons may rage, and the stars may burn, but somewhere, in the depths of the immaterium, the silence waits. And perhaps that silence is smiling. If mankind barely dares to whisper of the frozen warp, imagine what secrets lie buried in the ruins of those who faced it long before us. The galaxy is old. The stars remember empires that rose and fell long before the Emperor strode Terra. And among those fallen civilizations, there are clues, half glimpsed, half buried, that speak of encounters with something cold, something alien, not just in shape, but in concept. The frozen warp may not be a new horror. It may be an ancient one, known to others who lacked our arrogance, but shared our terror. The Eldar are the most obvious source of speculation. Their psychic mastery predates humanity's fumbling understanding of the immaterium by millennia. In the darkest vaults of their craft worlds, seers speak of a pre-fall age when the Eldar pushed the limits of psychic exploration. It is said that some among them sought to map not just the warp's tides but its boundaries, to chart where madness ebbed and flowed, and perhaps even to contain it. The frozen warp may have been discovered, or worse, created during such an expedition. One apocryphal legend speaks of the Womb of Silence, a place where an entire conclave of farseers vanished, leaving behind only shards of crystal that hum in dead tones. Their souls, it is said, did not feed she who thirsts, they simply disappeared. But the Eldar were not alone in reaching too far. The ancient Necrontyre, before their biotransference into soulless immortality, despised the warp. Their science rejected it. Their hatred of chaos was not born of ideology, but of incompatibility. The Necrons, their current form, are entirely inert in the immaterium. But what if their hatred of the psychic realm led them to attempt to wound it? Could the frozen warp be the scar left by some Necron weapon, a psychic neutron bomb designed not to kill Daemons, but to silence the very song they dance to? The Silent King, ever wary of warp energies, may know of this region and avoid it with the same cold dread he feels for the Old Ones. Speaking of which, the Old Ones, those mythic shapers of life, who once battled the Necrontire in the War in Heaven, wielded the warp like a scalpel. Their mastery was total, their psychic creations, like the Eldar and Krork, were tools of divine will. What if, in their last desperate efforts, they attempted to create a failsafe against the horrors they themselves unleashed? A final boundary, a firewall. The frozen warp could be their last breath, not a fortress, but a dead zone where their enemies could not tread, a place even gods would fear to cross. There are ruins scattered across the galaxy, not of stone, but of silence, worlds that bear no warp signature. Dead stars circled by perfectly preserved architecture, as though time itself froze in deference. Some believe these are remnants of civilizations that discovered the frozen warp and attempted to harness it. They built machines designed not to manipulate the warp, but to erase it. Psychic inhibitors so vast they poisoned entire star systems, but something always went wrong. The inhabitants are gone, not dead, simply erased. Their digital ghosts do not linger. Their cultures leave no echo in the Empyrean. It is as if they never existed. Among the more controversial accounts are the crystalline Xenos found in the Cronus Expanse, the so-called Mirrorborn. Reportedly discovered by a rogue dynasty, these beings exhibited no psychic footprint, despite engaging in technology that responded to emotional resonance. Their ships, too, left no warp trace. They navigated with silence. The dynasty that discovered them vanished after claiming to have found a still place where the warp curled in on itself. Whether the Mirrorborn were native to the frozen warp or simply born of its influence remains unknown. But their existence hints at life beyond the emotional spectrum, entities that evolved not with soul, but with stasis. And then there are the Tyranids. While not warp-born, the hive mind operates on a psychic gestalt so vast that its movements ripple across the immaterium. Yet there are regions where even the hive mind falls strangely mute. Some vanguard fleets have been observed changing course around seemingly unremarkable voids. Inquisitorial observers theorize that the hive mind recoils from the frozen warp instinctively, not from fear, but because its psychic feelers find no purchase. The Great Devourer consumes everything, but even it may have no appetite for silence. The Tau, though relatively new to the galactic stage, provide an intriguing footnote. Their limited warp presence has always puzzled scholars, their souls dim to the point of near invisibility. But what if their psychic stasis is not natural? What if their emergence near regions adjacent to frozen warp anomalies is no coincidence? Could their psychic nullness be an adaptation or contamination? A genetic echo of exposure to a region where the warp does not whisper? We must also consider that some races may have succeeded in fleeing demonic corruption by diving into the frozen warp, willingly. Perhaps entire species, driven to the edge by chaos, chose oblivion over madness. They sailed into the stillness and ceased to be, not destroyed, but disintegrated into peace. Or perhaps they dwell there still, changed, silent, existing in a state of pure order beyond our capacity to understand. What is certain is this: the frozen warp does not belong to mankind. It did not begin with us, and it will not end with us. We are merely the latest to tremble at its edge, to speculate, to fear. Others stood here before. Others were erased. Their silence is a warning and a temptation. When the Great Rift tore through the galaxy, when the Cicatrix Maledictum split the stars with screaming light, and the Astronomicon flickered like a dying firefly, the Imperium knew fear on a scale unseen since the heresy. The Noctis Aeterna, the night unending, swallowed half the galaxy in psychic blindness. For a time, even the throne itself seemed dimmed. Warp storms raged unchecked. Demons flooded reality like rot through a broken dam. But even in that apocalyptic darkness there was noise. Fury, chaos, the howling of 10,000 worlds on fire. What the Noctis Aeterna taught us was that the warp could scream louder than we had ever known. But what it did not prepare us for was silence. There is a strange, almost perverse symmetry between the Noctis Eterna and the Frozen Warp. One is fire without light, the other light without heat. One rages, the other waits. Both defy the known laws of psychic space. Both resist navigation, communication, and comprehension. But while the rift shouts its presence with every ripple in the immaterium, the Frozen Warp does the opposite. It swallows sound, thought, presence. It is not an eye in the storm. It is a hole beneath it. And the more we study both, the more terrifying the question becomes, what if they are connected? Some radical Ordo Malleus savants suggest that the emergence of the Citrix Maledictum wasn't merely a rupture. It was a reaction. The warp lashing out, yes, but not into empty space. Into pressure. Into resistance. Perhaps the Frozen Warp, or some early stirring of it, began forming centuries ago, slowly draining resonance from the immaterium like a spiritual vacuum. The rift, then, becomes an immune response, a counterbalance. The gods of chaos, wounded by silence, unleashed fire. The warp screamed because it was being bled. Others speculate that the Frozen Warp is not the opposite of the rift, but its precursor. That the psychic collapse of certain regions, now traced to phenomena eerily similar to the Frozen Warp, weakened the structure of the immaterium, allowing the cicatrix to form like a crack, racing through glass already thinned. Perhaps the silence came first. And then, when the warp could no longer hold, the scream came after. We must also consider the more esoteric interpretation, that the Frozen Warp is not a void, but a reaction to excessive chaos. That, like antibodies flooding a fevered system, it represents the warp's attempt to stabilize itself, to rebalance. The Cicatrix Maledictum is not just a tear in the veil, it is a symptom of warp instability. And the Frozen Warp may be the auto-correction, not benevolent, not merciful, but coldly functional. Kill the emotion, starve the gods, reset the field. Yet what chills the blood more than any of these theories is the notion that the Noctis Eterna was only the beginning. The flare before the freeze. The screams before the silence. That what we thought was the worst the warp could offer was in fact a warning, a tantrum of desperation from powers already beginning to die. The Imperium suffered during the Great Rift, but the Daemons suffered more. They lost coherence. They multiplied wildly, burned brightly, and then flickered. Unstable, inconsistent. Some reports speak of demonic entities collapsing mid-materialization, not from opposition, but from weakness. We have long assumed that chaos would consume all, that the end would come in fire and blood, with warp rifts open like gaping maws across the stars. But what if that vision was wrong? What if instead the end comes with stillness? Not because the Imperium wins or because the Emperor triumphs, but because the warp burns itself out in defiance of an approaching silence it cannot stop. In this light, the Noctis Eterna becomes not just a nightmare, but a death rattle, a scream echoing into a void that does not answer. Perhaps the Cicatrix Maledictum is the warp clawing at the edges of the Frozen Warp, trying to keep its shape, trying to remember what it is. Chaos cannot live without meaning. The gods cannot exist without emotion, and when the stars no longer burn with passion or terror, what remains? Even now, some regions near the rift show signs of emotional degradation, not simply psychic interference, but true nullification. Astropaths report dreams that are not violent, but blank. Ships emerge from the warp not with madness, but with eerie silence. Psychers lose their spark, not from overload, but from starvation. And always, the coordinates drift closer to where whispers say the Frozen Warp begins. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica has quietly adjusted its training protocols. The Ordo Hereticus has ramped up purges of psychers reporting unresonant dreams. The black ships do not stop near certain systems anymore. None of this is said aloud, but the data speaks, and the silence that follows speaks louder. Perhaps the warp is not eternal. Perhaps it, too, can end. Not with fire, but with frost. Not with madness, but with meaninglessness. The Noctis Eterna showed us what happens when the warp is wild. The Frozen Warp may show us what happens when it dies. To a psyker, the warp is not merely a tool or a realm. It is breath, blood, the very current of their existence. It hums beneath their thoughts, threads through every synaptic flare, shapes dreams and nightmares alike. They do not merely sense the warp, they are shaped by it. Most live in fear of it. The strongest attempt to master it, all depend upon it. Which makes the existence of the Frozen Warp not just terrifying to them, but existentially corrosive. For within that silent null space, the very thing that defines them begins to unravel, slowly, subtly, inexorably. The initial symptoms are quiet. Psychers report a sense of dullness, as though their thoughts have lost texture. Not dead, but numb. Their visions lose clarity. The colors of the warp, those impossible shades of emotion and meaning, begin to fade, replaced by an absence they cannot articulate. It's not darkness, it's not cold, it is simply nothing. For the soul attuned to resonance, this is not peace, it is the beginning of death. Next comes the severance. The link to the Empyrean falters, not as it does during a warp storm, where chaotic interference disrupts perception. In the frozen warp, there is no resistance, no opposition, just emptiness. The psycher's mind reaches out and touches a void that offers no feedback, like speaking into a well and hearing no echo, like praying and knowing in your bones that nothing is listening, because nothing is there. Veteran psychers describe this moment as the worst pain of all, not physical, not even emotional. It is identity deep, a moment where they cease to feel like themselves, where memory, personality, conviction begin to lose cohesion. The warp reflects who they are. Without it, they become blurred versions of themselves, thoughts without edges, beliefs without weight. Some begin repeating themselves, others become mute. A few simply sit down and never rise again. Those who remain conscious long enough report hallucinations, but not demonic, not violent. Instead, they see absence, rooms filled with fog, people speaking without mouths, clocks that never tick. It's as if their minds, starved of psychic resonance, begin cannibalizing their own perception in an attempt to fill the void. A sanctioned psycher aboard the Sanctum Invictara recorded her final thoughts before disappearing in a region suspected to border the frozen warp. The transcript ends with a line etched not in ink, but burned into the parchment by psychic backlash. There is no scream, there is no silence, there is no me. The black ships which carry psychers to Terra for soul binding or execution are equipped with some of the most advanced Geller field generators in the Imperium. Yet even they have encountered anomalies near the theoretical coordinates of the frozen warp. One ship, the Penance of Guilt, vanished entirely from the warp for 6 standard days. When it reappeared, it was intact, but the choir was dead, not slain, not possessed, just lifeless. Their bodies had not aged. Their eyes were open. One autopsy revealed no soul signature, as if they had simply ceased to be persons. The navigator survived, but later immolated herself in her quarters, having scrawled on the walls a single phrase, "It blinked, and I was unmade." Scholars of the Scholastica Siccana now theorize that what psychers experience in the frozen warp is not death in the biological sense, but psychic unraveling. Their connection to the warp is not cut, it is absorbed, dissolved. They are not consumed like prey, but nullified like unwords erased from the lexicon of existence. Some posit that this effect is so profound that even soul stuff, the essence that normally survives death and feeds the warp, cannot escape. It is, in essence, true annihilation. Even non-psychers report eerie side effects when exposed. Servitors begin misfiring emotionally, stuttering out phrases they were never programmed to say. Null-blank individuals, like untouchables, become agitated, their normal psychic immunity disrupted by something more alien than even they can tolerate. Some lose consciousness. Others lash out in primal panic. Their talents make them resistant to the warp. But perhaps what exists in the frozen warp is not the warp at all. And then there are the rare accounts of psychers who somehow survive deeper exposure. Changed. Broken. Those who return speak little. Some have lost their abilities entirely, no longer able to light even a candle with their minds. Others display too much control, wielding power with terrifying precision, as if reshaped by contact with an intelligence that values silence over chaos. Their dreams are blank. Their minds too still. When questioned, they speak of a presence that was not cruel but final, not a god but a concept, not death but cessation. This leads to the most terrifying theory of all, that the frozen warp contains something, not a creature, not a realm, but a state. A truth so incompatible with psychic existence that to perceive it is to fall into it, to become part of the silence, not corrupted, not enslaved, just erased. Psychers have long been the torchbearers of mankind's spiritual war. But within the frozen warp, that flame cannot burn. Their gift becomes their vulnerability. Their light, a beacon swallowed by perfect void. And in that place where nothing answers the call of the soul, they do not die. They dissolve. If there's one institution in the Imperium that thrives on silence, secrets, and the burial of terrible truths, it is the Inquisition. And if there is one arm of the Imperium with the means to probe the edge of reality, to look into the abyss and come back with bleeding eyes and sealed lips, it is the Black Ships. Together, these two entities form the quiet bulwark against chaos, tasked with understanding the unthinkable, containing the unbearable. So it is no surprise that, behind locked vaults and triple-blessed encryption runes, the frozen warp has become a subject of desperate, secret study. The Ordo Malleus, charged with confronting the demonic, views the frozen warp with a mixture of dread and fascination. Here, at last, is something that not even the ruinous powers can endure. An enemy of the enemy, but not a friend. In reports too heavily redacted for public consumption, radical inquisitors speculate that the region could be weaponized. If the emotional nullification effect that kills Daemons is consistent and predictable, then perhaps it could be replicated. A psychic bomb, not of destructive force, but of resonance inversion, something that does not kill a demon in fire, but simply denies it existence. But even among radicals, there is hesitation. The problem is not just the horror of the silence, but its contagious nature. Test reports from restricted experiments, where psychic constructs were exposed to captured fragments of frozen resonance, show a disturbing trend. Containment fails not with explosion but with collapse. The surrounding warp does not react violently, it simply recedes, like a tide pulled back too far. Entire sanctified vaults lose their psychic pressure, wards stop glowing, Rosaria's talismans dim, the silence spreads. The Black Ships, meanwhile, have always had their own quiet doctrines. Beyond their sacred duty of collecting psychers for the soul-binding ritual or destruction, they are the Imperium's most frequent travelers through the Immaterium. They record more than they reveal, and in their unmarked databanks, held beneath the surface of Mars or encoded in living vaults on Titan, are logs of ships that strayed too close to the edge. Not many, just enough. Ships that passed through warp corridors that felt too still, where the Geller fields barely shimmered, where the psychers did not scream but merely went silent. Entire choirs vanishing without trace. Navigators reporting flat space, a term normally reserved for real space, being used in reference to the Immaterium itself. The Ordo Hereticus, too, has taken notice. Not because they seek to use the frozen warp, but because they fear its ideological implications. If such a place exists, it calls into question every tenet of the ecclesiarchy. How can the warp be the domain of the Emperor's wrath and chaos alike if there is a third state, a silence not born of piety or corruption, but of unbeing? Some conservative factions within the Ministorum have already classified the frozen warp as a heresy zone, not due to active blasphemy, but because its mere existence threatens the binary logic of salvation and damnation. The idea that something can exist beyond both, untouched by the Emperor or the ruinous powers, is intolerable. But not everyone in the Inquisition sees a threat. A quiet faction, whispered of among the most radical cells of the Ordo Xenos and Malleus, has a name for it: Project Pale Heart. They believe the frozen warp is not a weapon, but a solution. A psychic euthanasia for the galaxy, a place where all suffering ends, not in salvation, but in stillness. Some of them seek to guide the Imperium into alignment with the void, to create a new kind of humanity, one no longer dependent on the warp, no longer subject to its endless torment. Their symbol is a blank circle. Their motto, let it starve. These radicals experiment in hidden laboratories, using sanctioned psychers like sandbags against a tide they do not understand. Some work with gene-modified blanks, others with artificial psychic dampeners derived from Necron artifacts or forbidden Eldar tech. Their ultimate goal? To create a mobile void engine, a null space generator that can move through warp storms and silence them. Not as a weapon, as a harbinger. There are rumors that the Grey Knights themselves have been called to investigate some of these experiments, not to help, but to cleanse. At least one fortress monastery was reportedly destroyed by exterminatus under inquisitorial order, its archives sealed in code only the High Lords possess. What they found is unknown. What they feared remains encrypted. But something was enough to terrify even the Emperor's most incorruptible sons. Not all inquisitors agree. Some argue the region must be mapped, studied, understood, not for use, but for defense. If the frozen warp expands, the Imperium must be prepared. Not just militarily, but spiritually. Others insist it should be left alone, buried like a cancer too dangerous to cut out. And a few, the oldest and quietest among them, believe it is already too late, that the silence is spreading not from the outside in, but from within. Whatever the truth, the Inquisition's interest in the frozen warp is no longer academic. It is immediate, urgent. They do not argue about whether it is dangerous. They argue about what kind of danger it represents. Because in a galaxy where faith is fire and chaos is storm, the cold, still silence of the frozen warp offers something worse than opposition. It offers no answer at all. For the faithful of the Imperium, the warp is more than a psychic medium. It is a spiritual battleground, a realm of gods and daemons, of angels and monsters. The Ecclesiarchy teaches that the Emperor's divine light repels the foulness of chaos, that the warp is a corrupt mirror of the soul, and that all things flow from belief, either into salvation or into damnation. The Immaterium is the crucible in which faith is tested and proven. But the frozen warp, that lifeless silence in the midst of madness, shatters this understanding. It is a theological heresy given form, an affront not only to the ruinous powers, but to the Imperium's most sacred doctrines. The first and most devastating implication is this: if Daemons cannot survive in the frozen warp, what does that say about the Emperor's light? The Ecclesiarchy teaches that the Emperor is the warp's master, that his will burns brighter than chaos, and that the Astronomicon is his holy beacon. But if there exists a place where even his light cannot reach, or worse, where his light might be the cause of the silence, then the structure of religious certainty begins to crack. Is the frozen warp a miracle, a curse, or is it something other? A state that denies not just chaos, but divinity itself. Some imperial theologians have tried to reckon this contradiction by proposing the concept of the silent grace, a theoretical state of divine will so absolute that it no longer manifests as action, but as absence. In this view, the frozen warp is the Emperor's final act of mercy, a realm where the suffering of chaos is impossible, where souls go not to burn or be judged, but to rest. But this is a dangerous belief. If the warp is emotion, and the Emperor is the guide of emotion toward righteousness, then to create a space without feeling is to deny the path of redemption. It suggests that the Emperor is not a shepherd, but an eraser. The Ecclesiarchy cannot abide such ambiguity. Their power rests on clarity, sin and sanctity, damnation and salvation. The existence of a third state, not holy, not evil, but nothing, undermines that duality. It introduces the possibility that souls can be lost without being condemned, that suffering is not inevitable, but escapable, not through faith, but through disconnection. And in a galaxy built on the twin pillars of fear and hope, this is a theology of collapse. Some heretical cults have already seized upon this. The cult of the Quiet Flame, reportedly eradicated in Segmentum Tempestus, believed that the Emperor had ascended beyond godhood into absolution, a state where he no longer acted, but simply negated. They prayed not for his blessing, but for his silence. Their members did not chant, did not scream, did not fight. They meditated in stillness, waiting for the day when the frozen warp would reach them and erase their burdens. Their writings speak of the calm shepherd and the end without fire. Even more dangerous is the theological paradox this presents to those who believe in chaos. For the heretic, for the daemon worshipper, the warp is divine. To them, the gods are eternal, entropy is sacred, and change is truth. The existence of a region where the gods cannot reach, where change halts, and where sacred entropy collapses into stillness is not just a threat, it is apostasy. It suggests that chaos is not the ultimate reality, but a fleeting storm, that beyond it lies a quiet sky. The word-bearers, whose entire existence is devoted to the worship of the chaos pantheon, are said to have burned entire libraries upon encountering hints of the frozen warp. Lorger's own writings, long hidden, hint at a fear that beneath the gods, beneath the dreams and the nightmares, there is nothing. And that this nothing is patient, waiting, immutable. In his most cryptic verse he wrote, "They sing because they are afraid of the silence, but the silence sings back now." For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the implications are no less shattering. The machine god is said to reside in the warp, a logic amidst chaos. But what if there is a state beyond logic and chaos alike? A perfect null. A static equilibrium where even divine code cannot execute. Some tech priests now wonder if the frozen warp is the shadow of the Omnissiah. Not its presence, but its absence. A place where machines go not to function or fail, but to forget they were machines at all. And then there is the human soul. If it does not feed the warp within the frozen region, where does it go? Ecclesiarchy doctrine holds that the soul upon death passes into the emperor's judgment, or is consumed by demons. But what if there is a third outcome? Oblivion. Not damnation, not salvation, just gone. It is a truth too terrifying to preach, and yet it may be the most honest gospel ever whispered. The theological response across the Imperium has been silence, denial, and extermination. Those who speak too clearly about the frozen warp vanish, not by demonic hand, but by ecclesiastic purge. The ecclesiarchy would rather bury the anomaly than confront its implications, because in that quiet place, all their psalms become noise. All their fire becomes flicker. All their gods become ghosts. Faith thrives on opposition. It needs heresy to define piety, darkness to give shape to light. But the frozen warp offers no such contrast. It does not resist the emperor. It does not challenge the gods. It simply does not care. And that, for the faithful, is the greatest blasphemy of all. There is a peculiar kind of comfort in terror. It sounds contradictory, but it is truth. Chaos, for all its grotesque horror, is knowable. A daemon may rip your soul from your body, but at least it does so with passion. The warp may drive you mad, but madness still presumes a self to unravel. Even the gods of chaos, monstrous and unfathomable, offer meaning. Apathy, gluttony, rage, mutation, they are reflections of something real, something human. You can fear Khorne, curse Slaanesh, dread Nurgle, loathe Tzeentch, you can hate them. And in that hatred, there is identity. There is resistance. There is noise. But the frozen warp offers none of this. It does not tempt or punish or speak. It does not watch. It does not care. And for a universe built on passion, on war, on faith, on rebellion, this silence is a greater terror than any demon. Because it means nothing. Literally. Absolutely. And that kind of nothing is not merely absence, it is obliteration. We've always understood fear as something with shape. A claw, a scream. A scream responds to you. It is directed, it engages. The warp storms howl. The daemons laugh, the warp cares. But in the frozen warp, there is no howl. There is no presence. There is no feedback. Your emotions mean nothing. Your fear has no echo. Your prayers fall flat. You could set yourself ablaze in sacrifice, and the silence would neither flicker nor warm. In this region, emotion itself becomes a dying spark, not because it is drained, but because it cannot stick. The psychic resonance that gives meaning to anything, love, grief, rage, slides off like oil on glass. You still feel at first, but it fades, and the dread sets in. Not fear of pain, but fear of being irrelevant to the universe itself. The idea that even your terror is unworthy of reaction. Those who study the region speak of a psychological phenomenon unique to it. Conceptual suffocation. As thoughts lose weight, the mind scrambles to find friction, something to push against, something to define itself by. When it finds none, it begins to fray. Not in insanity. That would be too passionate. No, the fraying is gentle, slow, like watching a statue worn smooth by centuries of wind. The edges of the self are not broken, they are sanded down. And when enough of the shape is lost, what remains? This is the true horror of the frozen warp. It is a terror that does not scream. It stares, not with eyes, not even with intent. It stares like a corpse stares, unblinking, unjudging, unmoved. It is the horror of cosmic indifference, of discovering that the abyss doesn't look back. Not because it lacks eyes, but because you are beneath its notice. You are not the ant beneath the boot. You are the air around the boot. Irrelevant. Some have described this terror as meta-nihilism. The fear that not only does nothing matter, but that the very capacity for things to matter has been lost. Chaos at least offers meaning through contradiction. The warp, even in madness, affirms existence. It reflects you. Twisted, yes, but real. But the frozen warp reflects nothing. Not because it is dark, but because it refuses the act of reflection altogether. Like trying to see yourself in a pane of air. There are legends of beings who ventured too deep into the region and emerged blank. Not dead, not demonic, just emptied. Adepts who forgot language. Astartes who could no longer remember why they fought. One inquisitor, famous for her war against the word-bearers, emerged from a short expedition into the fringe of the anomaly and renounced the Imperium. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in pure apathy. Her execution was swift. Her final words were not defiant, but haunting. There is no cause, there is no war, there is only a whisper that erases all. Even daemons, creatures forged from primal concept, react with visible horror to the mention of this place. Those rare times they are coerced into speaking, they shake, not with anger but with instinctual dread. The warp is their body. The frozen warp is a cancer, not growing, not killing, but unmaking. They cannot fight it, they cannot consume it, they cannot even scream at it. For scream as they might, the silence never flinches. For chaos, that is the ultimate defeat. And perhaps, for us as well, because if the warp is truly a mirror of the soul, and the frozen warp is expanding, then what does that say about the state of our own spirits? Have we exhausted our capacity for belief, for passion, for defiance? Is the silence not an enemy, but a reflection of our own fatigue? We often say the galaxy will end in fire. But fire is a drama, fire is a song, fire is a protest. And there are those now who fear, in the deepest places of their hearts, that the galaxy will not burn, that it will go still, and that stillness, cold and unfeeling, will erase the stars with the same indifference as it erased the first scream. Not because it is evil, not because it wins, because it doesn't care. In a galaxy forever burning, where every star is a candle guttering in the winds of war, the idea of a place untouched by chaos, unlit by faith, unbent by will, that is the most alien thing of all. The frozen warp is not a weapon, not a shield, not a place you can conquer or defend. It is an absence. And in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, where emotion fuels power, where gods rise from hatred and armies march on belief, such an absence is not merely dangerous. It is the end of everything. Because the Imperium survives through conviction. The Astartes believe in the Emperor's light, the Sisters of Battle burn with holy fire. Even the traitor legions, monstrous and damned, are still believers. In pain, in freedom, in chaos. But the frozen warp has no room for belief. It does not corrupt, it does not redeem, it simply forgets. And that forgetting, that psychic inertia, is more terrifying than any plague, any sword, any demon. The threat of the frozen warp is not that it destroys, it's that it erodes, slowly, patiently, unquestionably. Entire sectors may go quiet, not because they were bombarded, but because they were unremembered. Whole faiths may vanish, not in apostasy, but in apathy. It is not the fire that ends the song. It is the silence after the last note has faded. And yet, even in that silence, there is something profoundly, unsettlingly beautiful. A final stillness. A quiet so total that not even the screams of demons can enter. It is the end of pain, the end of torment, the death of gods. A graveyard not of bodies but of concepts. If the warp is a mirror of the soul, then the frozen warp is the mirror after the soul has left, a glass with no reflection because there is no one left to reflect. For some this is horror, for others it is mercy. Perhaps that's why so many factions approach it with fear and awe. The Inquisition seals it in shadow, the Ecclesiarchy declares it taboo. Chaos denies it, because to accept it is to admit vulnerability. And the Imperium, so driven by the desperate need to believe that their suffering has meaning, would rather burn 10,000 innocents than look into that still, unmoving dark. But it is there. It waits. Maybe it is expanding. Maybe it is static. Maybe it has always been there. Waiting for us to stop shouting, stop killing, stop screaming, long enough to hear it. And when we finally do, what will we become? The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is defined by its noise, its fury, its endless conflict. But perhaps, far beyond the cries of the dying and the roars of daemons, past the edge of madness and the edge of hope, the universe is winding down. Perhaps the frozen warp is not an enemy to fight, but a horizon we are all slowly moving toward. And when we reach it, there will be no victory. There will be no peace. There will only be stillness. If this deep dive into the frozen warp has chilled your soul and ignited your imagination, make sure to subscribe for more grimdark theories, forbidden lore, and terrifying truths. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But perhaps one day, not even that,